Good morning, guys. I am back here to read Polaris with you again today, and I want to apologize because I read chapter 7 for you guys yesterday, but it wouldn't post because it was too long. I took too long to read it, and it gets almost posted, and I've been trying all night, and it won't quite post. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to post two chapters. I'm going to read chapter 7 again, and I'm going to read chapter 8, and hopefully I can do it fast enough that they won't be too long to post. Chapter 7. The first step. Since he could walk, or at least since he could swim, it had been Owen's dream to one day occupy the captain's cabin on a ship, such as the Polaris. But not like this. Comfort was not the issue. As the ship rocked gently beneath him, his hanging hammock cradled him softly and stayed more or less level. No, it was the tragic circumstances that bothered him, that and the company. The others were arrayed all around him, anywhere they could hook two ends of the hammock. Every available sleeping space was taken, with the notable exception of the captain's bed. It was a sturdy wooden shelf built into the wall and topped with a feather pillow and a soft red blanket. As comfortable as it looked, the thought of anyone else sleeping there seemed ludicrous. The once stately cabin itself now felt more like a one-room schoolhouse. It was all so out of order that it boggled the cabin boy's mind. It wouldn't have been so bad if we'd set watches, he thought. Then half of us would be on the deck. But safely at anchor and exhausted, they had called off watches. It was a collective decision made simply by not doing it. It troubled him. But he was so tired, and it was true enough. There were no mates left to lead the watches anyway. They figured it all out in the morning, he'd hoped. He rolled over, scrunched his eyes closed, and tried again to sleep. The Polaris did its part, gently rocking back and forth, but it was no use. Owen lay awake for most of the night. On the few occasions he managed to nod off, he dreamed of bloody mutiny. He'd wake, confusing it for a memory, until he recalled that he couldn't possibly have seen any of it from inside the cabin. Then he remembered the utter helplessness he'd felt, locked in the fighting when the fighting erupted, vainly ramming his shoulder against the thick door. Then came the tragic end. The sight of traitors cresting a wave in the launch, disappearing into the darkness. Curse them! All around him, the others fought their own nocturnal battles. He heard Manny talking in his sleep, a few feet away, mumbling something in Spanish before punching a half-formed fist in the air, striking out at the nightmare. Manny nearly hit Mario. In a darker corner by the door, Aaron sniffled. Or was it the botanist's assistant? It was too dark to tell. And Owen was honestly glad. Whoever was crying, they deserved at least a little bit of privacy. It was the first peaceful thought that he had had all night, and moments later he finally fell into a sound sleep. He woke just before dawn. He shifted in his hammock and craned his neck over its canvas edge. He stared out of the bank of windows at the back of the cabin until he saw it. There, he thought, the first streaks of gray rose like vapor from the eastern horizon. He loved this moment. How the sunrise brightened the ocean below faster than it lit the sky above. Faint light spread across the face of the sea, hinting at its vast depths and all the living things moving there. From the littlest minnow to the mightiest whale, he gave up on sleep and tried to think of nothing but what was happening beyond the windows. A thin slice of clear light spread across the horizon, and the sky turned brighter gray above it. The lead melting upward. The sea lit up with the first subtle shades of green and blue, and then, like a big egg or a small miracle, the first golden rays of sun cracked the horizon. Owen knew now that the day ahead would be sunny and fair, and he allowed himself a small smile. But a moment later, the memories came crashing back. The smile fell from his face, and his jaw locked in a firm resolve. He looked around the cabin in the dim light. Drool ran down Henry's cheek, and Aaron rolled into his side, away from the light. And Thatcher lay so still that he might just as easily have been dead. With no one on watch and no officer to call all hands at first light, the others had overslept. The Polaris was now theirs. For better or for worse, strike that, thought Owen. for worse. And on the very first day, they were already running late, and on a storm-damaged ship, no less. He swung over the side of the hammock, filling his lungs with the stale air of the cabin. "All hands," he shouted. "Turn, you dogs!" There had been enough slacking in the night, tragedy, fear, and confusion. Whatever the cause, they had already bent enough of the rules for a lifetime at sea. Captain Igling was gone. Owen could deny it no longer, but every ship needed a leader, he thought, and there was still some of Igling's bloodline aboard. A new day had dawned, and if no one else would do it, Owen was of mind to crack the whip. "Come on, forward now," called Owen. "Let's man the pump." Henry blinked up in the early morning sun, wiped the sleep from his eyes, and followed the others forward across the deck. "So we're washing down the deck?" said Thatcher. "Of course," said Owen. Henry caught Manny and Mario exchanging quick glances. The crew began every day by washing the deck, a laborious task that could take 2 hours. Henry was all for cleanliness and routine, but the deck had gotten an extremely thorough washing down in the storm, and that wasn't the only benefit of all that rain. "The scuttle bucket is full, as a ripe berry," said Aaron. The barrel of drinking water had been lashed securely to the foremast before the storm, and no one had thought to remove it afterward. Now it was brimming with fresh, clear rainwater. Henry's throat was dry, and his mouth was sour, but he hesitated. He knew by now that you never did anything without permission aboard a ship. This was still the case, and if not, then why was everyone else hesitating too? Could it be as simple as a force of habit? "Drink up, then," said Owen, halting his march toward the seawater pump. "Grab a cup." Henry held back as the ship's boys rushed the barrel. There were 2 cups hanging from the side of the barrel on the lengths of the moldy twine, and he waited as the others gulped down the cool water. His turn finally came, but as soon as he picked up the cup Aaron had just dropped, Owen called out again, "Enough! You'll drown yourselves!" The cabin boy turned and resumed his march toward the elm tree pump, and the others fell in line like ducklings. Henry gulped down half a cupful, coughed, burped, and followed. But once again he had held back as a more knowledgeable hand set to work. The Polaris had 2 pumps. One pump for the bilge water out of the hold, and another pumped seawater onto the deck. Henry stared at the latter. It was a marvelous thing, he thought, a hollowed-out tree trunk that went down through the decks into the ocean below. It was only by the sheer wonder of the science, air pressure, and water pressure, and equilibrium that it did not sink the ship immediately. As Owen grabbed the handle and the Spanish brothers grabbed the buckets, Henry ventured a quick look around the deck. Aaron was standing beside him, staring out at the rail as the sun inched its way above the horizon. The sunlight was straight on, nearly horizontal, and it skipped brightly off the tops of the little wind-tossed waves, turning the face of the sea into an endless field of sparkling diamonds. It astounded Henry that the sea could be so terrifying one moment and so casually beautiful the next. "You too!" bellowed Owen. In it, between cranks of the pump handle, Henry knew before he even turned around that Owen meant him and Aaron. "Make yourselves useful and grab a swab!" Henry pulled his eyes from the sunrise and looked back at the cabin boy, just to make sure. He got a fierce glare and a "Yes, you" nod for his trouble. He remembered Owen the night before, benumbed by grief and offering little opinion on anything. He was definitely back to his old bossy self today. Must not have slept well, he thought, as he and Aaron headed for the little shack on the deck. It had once been the goat house before the poor creature's milk had dried up and they had eaten her. Now it was where they kept the mops and other instruments of drudgery. "Is he captain now?" Henry whispered as they were far enough away. Aaron turned to look back at Owen, still cranking at the pump as the seawater began to splash forth, half into the bucket and half onto Mario, who was holding it. Aaron whispered, "Only in his mind." Henry chuckled, and Aaron continued, "But he's the best sailor, and I suppose we should listen to him, if we don't want to sink." The smile fell from Henry's face, and for the first time, it hit him, really hit him. The situation they were in now, they would have to get the ship to port themselves. He turned and looked back at the others. They really looked at them, children, all of them, not one with any real use for a shaving razor. They had callous hands and knotty muscles, to be sure, but what experience did any of them have running a ship? He glanced back over at Aaron. Did he seem a little nervous to you? Yes, Henry decided. But then, Aaron was always nervous. His jaw had been carrying gunpowder. Henry swallowed hard, his throat already gone dry again. He spent the next 2 hours pushing an old rope-headed mop around the deck. He could see that it was just making things worse. The storm-blasted deck was clean to begin with. Even the 4 canyons perched vigilantly along the rail seemed to be gleam in the morning light. But the mop was old and moldy, and with the ship riding low, it stirred up shallows of the seawater. In his bucket was gritty with sediment. The little lump of lye soap dissolving inside seemed to do nothing but give it all a toxic smell. Still, Henry knew better than to point any of this out. He considered himself a scientist, and as such, he learned by careful observation. What he had observed so far in this week at sea as routine trumped common sense every time. He'd been lucky in one sense. During those weeks, death may have fallen all about him like wintry hail, but he'd been spared the endless physical labor aboard the ship. After the doomed expedition had returned, he'd made himself useful by helping the purser out with the ship's logs. In fact, by the end, he'd basically been doing the man's job for him, recording every keg of salt pork, butter, and water opened, and every piece of equipment cracked. He hadn't been at all surprised to spot the good-for-nothing purser riding away on the launch among the mutineers. So now he pushed his old mop without complaint as the others scrambled down and do their share of the chores and maintenance that seemed to occupy every waking moment aboard the ship. Before Dr. Weatherby disappeared into the Amazon, he explained to Henry this way: a sailing ship is, like your Latin, always in need of work. He missed the old doctor so powerfully that even the memory of his insult made Henry's eyes begin to water. "Hold up," Manny called. Henry held his swab still as Manny and Mario knelt down in front of him and removed the storm cover from the grating, and once they stood back up, he proceeded to coat the latticework of the little wooden squares with grungy seawater. As he did, he peered below deck. He remembered the night before, the fierce shifting shadows, that strange smell again. Standing in the morning light, he wanted to dismiss it, to write it all off to a feverish imaginations of the night, but he was a scientist, and after all, he learned by careful observation. And at the end, just before they'd fled back up the hatch, he had seen something. He shivered deeply in the warm morning and pushed his mop quickly across the grate, a quick twirl around the old goat house, back where he'd started, and he was done. He mopped around the old shack once more, for good measure, dreading what he'd be assigned next. Something shippish and sailory that I have no idea how to do, no doubt, he thought. But when Aaron returned to the shack, Henry gave up his mop and put it away. For a moment, the two stood side by side in the sun. There were no officers left to call up the time, but the dawn was over, and it was well and truly morning. "Must be 7 bells by now," said Aaron. Owen, who was climbing in the rigging 10 feet above their heads, either heard him or was thinking the same thing. And 7 bells into the morning watch meant that a particular thing on board a working ship. "Who wants to go down to the galley and fetch breakfast?" Owen called down. Everyone looked around at each other. Henry's eyes flicked back over the grate. The galley was below deck, in the deep ship's shadowy heart. "2 of you should go," Owen shouted, issuing his orders literally from high. No one volunteered. Henry looked over at Aaron in a slight panic. Was it too late for them to grab their mops and try to look busy again? "Right," Owen called. "No breakfast this morning. A dozen rules were broken last night." He paused, and Henry wondered if he would acknowledge his own part in the general disobedience. Instead, he barreled on. An empty belly seemed a fit punishment. And this time, we set sail for home. As Owen scrambled down the rigging, the angled rope shrouds that kept the mast centered on the horizontal ratlines that it all into a vast network of rope ladders. The others exchanged glances again. These looks were different, and Henry saw a hesitation in them. By unspoken agreement, they'd all consented to accept the orders of Owen, at least for now. He was currently the most experienced sailor, and all raised by sea. He scurried down the ratlines now with an instinctive ease of a monkey at a vine, but he was no older than the rest of them, and it was highly debatable whether he was any wiser. Manny looked on to Mario. Aaron looked into Henry. Thatcher stared back up at Owen. Orders were one thing, but should he really accept punishment from this boy? Orrin reached the rat line, swung down, and landed squarely on the gently rolling deck. His bare feet slapped in the freshly slobbed soil, and he turned to face the others. "Work hard, and we'll have an early dinner," he said, "when the sun is high overhead." Everybody nodded. When the sun was high overhead, and the sunlight through the grates and hatches was the brightest, that's when they'd go down for their meal. Suddenly, everyone was in agreement. "Fair enough," said Thatcher. "I'm not hungry yet anyway," added Aaron, in a lie so obvious that Henry nearly laughed out loud. The young crew made another trip to the scuttlebutt. A cup of water would be their breakfast. And then it would begin. The complex and grueling task that went into weighing anchor and setting sail. The United States of America. The words floated into Henry's head as he dropped the cup and wiped his lips. Still a young nation, but already a large one. He pictured the globe back in Dr. Weatherby's study in Boston. There were on a fat part now, near the equator. They needed to climb the slope, not over a few inches of blue ink and dotted lines, but through hundreds of miles of treacherous ocean. He could picture the painted outline of the United States clearly. If he were ever to set foot on his soil again, this would be their first step. And if they were to die trying, this would be the first step in that too. All right, see you guys in a little while.